you. Thank you.
I have to ask a question, Anita. This morning, you introduced yourself in the big get to know, which is a tradition here, and you got a standing ovation then, and you got a standing ovation right now. Is that just something that happens for you regularly?
Well, it doesn't happen everywhere.
A lot of places?
Well, it does happen in some places, and I attribute it to a lot of things, and I've actually had a conversation with some of you since then. I think today I attribute it to the this moment in history that we're all experiencing, and some of the emotions that we're reliving. And so it varies from time to time, but I think we are all sharing a moment now where we want to get closer. And I also like to believe that we want to believe that Christine Blasey Ford can survive, that I survived, and that each of us will survive this time and any of the indignities that we've experienced.
Well, there's a lot that you've just jammed into just that opening few sentences, so I'm going to try to unpack them a little bit. I want to start with the moment. So I have to ask, did you watch?
I watched part in real time. I watched some since then to kind of go back and sort of from a distance, kind of knowing how things turned out. But it was difficult to watch in real time because you didn't really know what the end would be, how it would feel and look at the end of the day. So I think I've seen probably most of that hearing, but just not all at the time that it was happening.
So I have to ask, it's interesting, you speak in not the first person when you talk about that. You say you feel, you didn't say I. How did you feel?
How did I feel?
I think we all wonder because you're literally the only person who knows what that felt like.
Well, and so I'm the only person who has had to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee, but I really think that a lot of people have a good sense of what it feels like, because any number of us have been in those situations where we either didn't come forward because we didn't think we would be believed, or we didn't think it mattered. We have suffered some indignities that we didn't care to share, but more importantly, we thought that nothing would happen, even if we shared it. Nothing positive would happen. But I've heard from people from all over the country since the day of the testimony, and many people really say that it felt like it was sickening. It was like a punch in the stomach for them. People say they couldn't go to work that day. They watched it alone because they just really didn't know how they were going to process the feeling. So you can't know exactly how it feels, but I think if we just tap into how we feel about it, we will not only have a lot of sympathy, but I think there's a level of empathy that is possible if we just allow ourselves.
But the national attention, the must-see TV, the spotlight, the cameras, you said you looked at some of the differences in the moment, that your room was smaller.
No, my room was actually bigger.
Your room was bigger.
There was a bigger distance between the long table and
Was that more comforting, you think?
I don't know. It was just different. I don't think that I would have I didn't like the way mine felt, but I don't think I liked the way that she seemed to be very close to this huge panel of senators, some of whom she knew were hostile to whatever she had to say. They had already made up their minds about it. So that kind of closeness, that proximity, I think would make it very, very difficult to testify. But you know, when you're in that moment, I will say this, when you're in that moment, those are not necessarily the things that that are going through your head. I probably would not have realized had I not that there was a different setup in the room, except that it was 27 years later that I was seeing it, and I was watching somebody else on TV. It is your reality at that moment. And you're dealing with whatever that reality is.
But the deja vu of it didn't have any effect?
I have had 27 years to process. and yes, it felt very familiar, but it didn't feel like me being there.
So 27 years have passed, and when I think about you, I think about the fact that you actually put sexual harassment in the workplace on the map. You single-handedly did that with that testimony. That doesn't mean lots of other women didn't have experiences that were very real and traumatic, et cetera, but you made it a national conversation at the time. What has changed since then?
Well, first of all, that was not my intention when I testified, not to make it a national conversation. I was testifying about the character of the person who was being considered for a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. And that's where we are today. So that's one of the things that I keep coming back to. Does it matter, or does it seem to matter from a point of view of the senators, whether or not the character and fitness of the person who is being considered for this appointment? Is that what is in their minds when they're questioning someone who comes forward? And I have to say that at least for some of the senators, that didn't seem to matter. It didn't matter then, and it doesn't seem to matter now. They don't get the connection between someone who would be abusing the law of the country in this kind of way, in the kind of way around sexual misconduct and sexual assault, and then how that person puts himself or herself above the law, and what that says about their ability to be a justice deciding the law. And I think we're still at that quandary. The fact that they cannot align the interest of getting to the heart of the truth of whether or not a sexual assault or harassment occurred, and align that interest with the interest of justice, to me, is apparent. They couldn't align those two.
So should he be
And they still haven't, I don't think. Should he be confirmed? I wouldn't confirm him. I wouldn't.
And what about this process?
Let me tell you why. I can tell you exactly. I wouldn't, because I saw a demeanor that I think was inappropriate for a judge. I saw a demeanor that was of a statement that were making allegations without any facts to support them. That's the last thing that you want from a judge. I saw an individual who was seemingly blaming a senator like Senator Klobuchar when she asked him about blacking out, and sort of started to turn and point the finger at her. And so that's in and of itself. But then I saw someone who I thought didn't answer questions squarely. I mean, there were times when it was clear that if you looked at the facts, it wasn't exactly, they didn't line up. And for me, and I can say this, and you can call it, selfish or self-centered, anyone who lies in a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing should not be on the Supreme Court. Anyone who perjures themselves should be on the Supreme Court. And so that's where I am. I've tried to be hesitant about making any blanket, she should not be on the court. But much of that hesitancy could have been resolved had there been a full investigation. So I don't put all of this on Brett Kavanaugh, although he could have stepped up and asked for an investigation. I put the responsibility for making sure that I and everybody else in the public knew the truth and had an understanding of the truth. I put that responsibility on the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Which is interesting, and I want to get to that because the part of this conversation I want to very much be about practical solutions. Mm-hmm. We could admire this problem forever, and I certainly don't want this to be a referendum on politics, and I know that you don't either. Mm-hmm. And so I want to get to that nugget, which is process. You've been talking about process, that the process has not changed over this period, and that's actually the failure of the committee. Well, how should this process be different?
Well, the process should be different. It should have started off differently with a full and thorough investigation. And this is not a process that's isolated to the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is a process that, what I'm going to say about a process can translate to any of our workplaces. But first of all, you have to have an investigation. If you're going to have people ever come forward, if you're going to be able to count on people to come forward and talk about really the character of an individual, you've got to give them some way to step into this knowing that they're going to be treated fairly. And to start with an investigation is just the beginning. The investigation has to be thorough. It cannot be limited either in terms of
so they come back and they
length
say
of time.
six FBI investigations or 6 FBI background checks.
Well,
that's not
then
a,
it raises the question. That raises the question of whether it was thorough, because of the stuff that we're finding out now, if it wasn't discovered, can we say that those 6 were thorough investigations?
But I think part of what you also have been talking a lot about, it seems, is this whole idea of process and procedures is important for cultures, be it the Senate Judiciary Committee,
Absolutely.
Be it what you're doing now, which
Right.
I really want to spend a couple of minutes on, because you've chosen to actually do this work in Hollywood, which I think is probably a shocker.
To Hollywood.
No,
Yes.
I think listen, I like Hollywood. People know my husband is a film director, so that is not said with any condemnation. But it's not an obvious leap for you.
No,
and so you're doing
absolutely.
this work with the Commission on Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equity in the Workplace, targeted at the entertainment industry, but it's all, just like this Senate Judiciary Committee conversation, it's all about process.
But it's not targeting the entertainment
Okay.
industry. It's engaging the entertainment industry, and that's different. So what we have done is we brought together a group of leaders in the industry and working through their companies, we're identifying what are the best practices around reporting, for example. The fact that you have to have a safe reporting system for people to come into. It has to be well resourced. It has to involve training of management who are engaging in the intake, and you have to have well-trained investigators. You have to have transparency in the systems, so that when people come forward to raise a claim, that they know what they're going to go into. A lot of people don't go into these complaint systems because they have no idea how it works, and nobody tells them. You go in, and you're told to give your complaint, and you go away, and then you don't even know what's happening next. You've got to have responses when you find violations.
So many companies would feel like they've done that. Why don't you think it really exists to the extent that it should? And what's hard about what you're trying to do?
Because if you look at the way much of the reporting is done, and this is probably, some of it is very well intended. So I'm not trying to, certainly not talking about the entertainment industry or anyone disparagingly, but if you look at many of the reporting systems, the way they work now, they're underfunded, they're not transparent. They haven't trained investigators in how to investigate victims who have been traumatized, how to question. And things happen, and the results are not even shared. They're not communicated. People in your organization may not even know what the violations were or why they were violations. But there are other things that we have to do too. First of all, we've got to get a better sense of the enormity of the problem. We know about sexual harassment, and we know about the egregious nature of sexual assault. But what we allow to happen is a lot of just gender harassment, where comments are made about women that may or may not be sexual, and a lot of times they're not sexual, but they amount to harassment based on gender. And if we can start to get out in front of some of those, if we have proactive managers who can actually recognize that those are kind of gateway behaviors into sexual harassment, and give them tools to address those problems beforehand. So the problem is we shouldn't try to just limit it to the most egregious behaviors. We've got to get in front of it deal proactively with it. And we also have to understand that the problem is not just behavioral. There are systems and cultures that support it. And it takes a lot of work to take any organization through that. We're trying to do it with an entire industry that involves organizations that are structurally quite different, culturally quite different, but we believe that we can set up really a framework for reducing the amount of harassment, and we hope will work to advance equality in other ways too. So that, because we know that greater leadership, greater diversity, greater equality in general will lead to a reduction of sexual harassment. Those things go hand in hand. So I would just say, you know, it's a lot of work, but it's important work. What we don't want to happen after this moment, after what happened last October, after this moment, what we don't want to see is us reliving this again, over and over again, and asking ourselves, why didn't anything change?
Ladies and gentlemen, Anita Hill is working to make sure that's not the case. Thank you very much.